Now on this part, we are going to create the DbContext file, but before we create this file, it's really important to know about the importance of this file. Now the DbContext file in Entity Framework is a crucial component because it does represent a session with the database. It acts as a bridge between your application and the database, allowing you to query and save data. But what exactly does the DbContext file do? The first thing is that it manages the connection to the database. When you initiate the DbContext object, it does establish a connection to the database specified in its configuration. Next, the DbContext does track changes to entities within each session, and what this means is that it knows which objects have been modified, added or deleted, and it can efficiently update the corresponding database record when you call the SaveChanges method. You can also use the DbContext to execute queries against your database using LINQ, which we said was the language integrated query. This allows you to write queries using C# syntax, which then DbContext will translate into SQL queries and execute them against the database. DbContext will also help you manage database transactions. So you can use transactions to ensure that a group of operations either all succeed or fail together, maintaining this way the data integrity. Last but not least, you can configure different aspects of the DbContext, such as specifying which entities or database tables it should track, defining relationships between these entities, and also configuring database-specific settings like connection strings and database providers. So basically, the DbContext file serves as the entry point for interacting with your database in Entity Framework, and it does also provide a high-level abstraction that simplifies the database operations and allows you to work with database entities using object-oriented principles in your .NET applications. Now let us go to Visual Studio and create the DbContext file. In here, I'll just go to the Solution Explorer. And then in the data project, since the DbContext is going to be the most important file in this project, I don't need to create a separate folder. What I'll do, I'll just right click, then go to Add, and then a class. We are going to name this class because it's going to be a custom implementation of the base class DbContext, maybe just app DbContext, and then click the Add button. Now in here, I'm going to first change the internal to be public. But this file in here is just a class so far. For this to be the DbContext file of this project, you need to inherit from the base class DbContext. And DbContext does belong to the Entity Framework core, and this is why we installed this package in the first place. Just import the using up here. You can see that the error is gone. Now, inside this class, we are going to create a constructor. Now in here, I'm going to pass as a parameter. So in the app DbContext, I'm going to basically inject the DbContext options. But I'm going to explain on the next part what the DbContext options is all about. And then in here, I'm going to pass as a parameter the app DbContext. I'll just give this a name because I want to pass this to the base class, which is the DbContext. And to pass that, you need to use the base and then the options that you define in here. So basically, whenever you define the DbContext options, what this means is that when you configure or when you set up this DbContext file to be the default context for this application, you need to also pass as a parameter the database and the database server related information. But this is all we are going to do here on this part. Now let us also define the tables that we're going to have in our database. And we said that for tables in C# we have dbsets. So basically, whenever I type in here public dbset and pass as a parameter, let's say the URL model, and then I give it a name URLs, and then a get and set. Let me import the namespace. What we are defining in here is that for this model, I'm going to have a table in our database, and that table is going to be named URLs. Now, each column in that table is going to be represented by a property in this class. So basically, if I go to URL, and I can see here that I have ID and also original link, what this means is that in the URLs table, I'm going to have two columns, ID and original links. Now in here, let us also create the other DB sets. For that, public DB set user and then users. The same way, what this means is that for the users table in our database, we are going to use the user model in C# code. Now this is all for this part. On the next one, you'll learn how to configure the app DbContext.